I almost feel after listening to the second letter of James that me speaking is a bit redundant. It's so powerful and so direct, and it has some fantastic punchlines. One of the things I love about the letter, especially this famous one: "You believe that God is one, you do well. Even the demons believe and shudder." That fantastic power of reversal, that rhetoric of setting you up and then taking the ground from under your feet. And so all I wanted to talk about a little was two big reversals that I thought were happening in that chapter. First one about partiality and the second one about faith and works. And the first one is that first section of the chapter where James is challenging his readers not to show favouritism or partiality. But as soon as he's said that, of course, he starts to show his own partiality, if you like. Hasn't God chosen the poor? Isn't it the rich who oppress you? And I think, as Bill was saying last week, if you want to look at the Bible and say there's no politics in the Bible, there's nothing to do with economics and politics in the Bible, well, you've not only missed a great deal of it, you've certainly missed this chapter in James. Because what it seems he's saying here is that showing no partiality is not just about sitting on the fence. It's not about not taking any sides. Because in a situation of oppression, where it is in the communities James is talking about, it is the rich and the powerful and those who have status who oppress you, you can't be neutral. If you're neutral, you're accepting the status quo. If you're neutral, or pretending to be neutral, in a sense, you've already taken sides. You've taken sides with how things are. Now I remember, well, I don't remember personally, but almost, from the late 60s and early 70s, a great movement of liberation theology which arose in Latin America and then took shape in different parts of the global south. Liberation theology stood very strongly for what it called a preferential option for the poor. And some people felt that this was wrong, as well as what they saw as the dangerous leftism and Marxism of liberation theology. This option for the poor. Surely God was about universal love and universal compassion and wanted the salvation of everyone. I think what the liberation theologians were saying was that salvation only comes through addressing the inequality and oppression that exists, by standing with those who are the most vulnerable, standing with those who are the most dispossessed, so that you can actually unmask the forces which dehumanise us and which kill our potential, or kill the potential of those who are ground down. Of course, it's a dangerous thing to say that God is on anyone's side. You know, we've seen how that can work out in history, and in the history of wars and in the history of colonialism. Those who've claimed that God is on their side are too often standing exactly for those forces of domination. But I think what James is pointing us to here in his rejection of partiality is really a rejection of that acceptance of oppression and domination. So for James, the important thing is to stand with those who are being marginalised, excluded and oppressed. If you're being even-handed, you're just missing the point. And a contemporary example would be the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, in the United States, which has been in the news a lot and was again in the news yesterday, with eyewitnesses confirming that Michael Brown, a young black man, had his hands in the air and was going away from a police officer when he was shot. And people say, well, you know, maybe he robbed a store earlier in the day, and I overheard somebody the other day saying, obviously he was a thug, he was harassing people in a shop earlier in the day. So there's always two sides to the story. Well, yes and no. Of course, there's always more complexity in human relationships than a simple story will tell. But in this case, the bigger story is the structural racism which conditions law and order and the organisation of society, especially the legacy of that in the United States. So if you can't understand why people are looting and rioting in Ferguson and Mississippi and elsewhere, you're not really seeing that bigger picture, because even-handedness doesn't catch that. Neutrality doesn't capture that situation of structural oppression and inequality. So sometimes you have to take a risk and stand on one side or the other. when there's a conflict or a struggle. And that's a tricky thing to do. It's always a matter of judgment, of course, and there's no guarantee we'll get it right. But standing on the sidelines is also a choice. It's also standing somewhere. So that's, I think, the first bit about partiality, which I like that sort of opening with this great proclamation that you should not show partiality, and at the same time James quite clearly shows huge partiality to the poor, to the oppressed, and against the rich who drag you into court and have the power to do that. And more that's topical, isn't it? The ending of legal aid. How many poor people are going to drag the rich into court and hold them to account? It's not going to happen that often unless people band together. If you're rich, you have the longest court cases in history, and you can silence people and shut them down. The inequality and the structural issues of power are still with us. So the second point then is about faith and works. And famously, of course, this is quite an anti-Paul, or it's seemingly an anti-Paul bit of the letter of James, or at least an anti-aversion of Paul, or a misunderstanding or reading or interpretation of Paul. There were clearly big rows in the early church. We know this. Even the book of Acts, which is like, if you like, the official history of the early church, which got into the New Testament, doesn't disguise these major bust-ups that were happening, Paul with Peter, and so on. And of course Paul, in the letter to the Galatians, which is generally acknowledged to be an authentic letter of Paul, when he's talking about this issue of circumcision, should circumcision be expected of all converts to this new Jewish, essentially a Jewish Christian movement? Paul, of course, is against imposing circumcision on Gentile converts, and he says, "I wish those who unsettle you would castrate themselves." This is not the measured language of a Church of England report, is it? But I kind of like the fact it's in there. It's in the New Testament. It's part of the raw feeling and the power and the anger that people felt about these issues. So don't let people kid you, there's a golden age in the New Testament when we were all united and there were no arguments. And it's only been in the last 10 years when people started talking about women and gay rights that there have been arguments. What a load of nonsense. It's been there from the beginning. We're human. And James's worry with what Paul says, looking at it from the opposite point of view, because Paul obviously wants to emphasize that faith is the priority, that faith results from the free gift of grace that's given in Christ, and that if you rely on works, then you're falling back into this idea that by doing good works or by following the law, we earn our redemption, we earn our salvation, and he hates that idea. But James is worried about the opposite, of course. He's worried that by making faith everything and relegating the law to the second place, you turn faith into something overly spiritualized or overly bodiless, if I can put it like that. Now, I don't think James is saying that by doing good works we get lots of brownie points and God thinks we're all jolly good children and rewards us. He's saying that there's an intimate relationship between faith and works. It's not that you do works to prove anything, but if you have faith, if faith is what shapes your whole life and is a holistic thing, then it's going to shape the way in which you enact your spirituality in the world. The way you are with other people, what you do with your time, what you do with your money, what you do with your resources as a community. It's going to shape all of those things. Works express faith because we're not pure spirit. We're flesh and blood, and that's how we live. That's how we embody our lives and our values. And there's a great line, another little reversal, I think, near the end of chapter 2, where James says, "Just as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead." And I think this is I don't know if it's deliberate, but it makes me think he's having a little go at Paul talking about the letter kills, but the spirit gives life. You remember that? The letter kills, the spirit gives life. Of course, for Paul, faith is the spirit which gives life, and that is what liberates us, whereas the law is, in a sense, the dead letter, the thing that weighs us down and always keeps us stuck in sin, and we can't ever break beyond that. Well, James turns that round. As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead. Faith is the body, and works are the spirit. Works are what bring faith to life. Enacting it, embodying it, incarnating it, if you like. And I think there's something, if you like, radically Christian about that it's incarnating the divine, incarnating the Spirit is what gives it life. Because Bill was talking last week about this engaged spirituality, which James, I think, captures here. You might also call it an embodied spirituality. It's a spirituality that has to do with our embodied lives, our yearning, our food, our drink, our sexualities, all of those things, our communities. The way in which we enact our values is key for James. So you can see why Luther, when he was trying to fight what he saw as an overemphasis on works of merit, that you could do certain things which would get you merit towards your salvation, why he was pretty unhappy with the letter of James, and famously said it's an epistle of straw, because it seemed to him James was regressing back to relying on the law. But as I've said, I don't think for James the point is anything to do with merit or earning brownie points or being a good kid and keeping your nose clean so you can get the headmaster's award at the end of the year like they do at Ben's school. You have to get a sticker every week at Ben's school. If you get 2 warnings in a day, you don't get your sticker for that week, which means you don't get your head teacher's award at the end of the year. Now that's kind of motivational reward points, and I don't think this is about that. It's about saying there's an intimate relationship between faith and works, between spirit and incarnation. You can't have one without the other. That's not how we live. We are whole people in all our flaws. We are embodied and incarnate. So taking care of our bodies and the bodies of others and the physical nature of the world, our ecology which sustains us, all that is not a distraction from the Spirit, but is its expression. And I think that's why, in his context, in his time, James would have had different concerns, but why he sees the law as the law of liberty, not as a dead weight to carry around with you, but as a constant reminder to embody what we believe. So, for me, there are 2 things that I like in this chapter that challenge me. One about partiality and how that actually means taking sides with the poor. Rejecting partiality for James still means you take sides with the poor. And the other is this intimate connection, as I said, between faith and works. The Spirit is something that's always embodied and always part of our flesh and blood reality. So I didn't have anything more to say there, and I don't know if I wanted to sort of have a few minutes if people had any reflections of their own on this chapter. Maybe whether you see any, there are obviously tensions between this impartiality on the one hand, don't show favouritism, and taking sides on the other, whether there are situations where we find that a particular challenge, when do you take sides? And maybe the more general thing about that relationship between faith and works, how we can have an emphasis on this embodied enacting of our faith without that just becoming another, exercise in gaining brownie points or worse still, driving ourselves with guilt. Because I'm a Christian, I must be doing X, Y, and Z, and I never do enough, and so I'm a bad Christian. Well, this is something that's good about Paul. We're all bad Christians and good human beings. That was the title of that book that Bill quoted, wasn't it? How to be a bad Christian and a better human being. Well, we're all bad Christians. If we drive ourselves with guilt, I don't think that's going to get us anywhere. I don't think that's what James is saying. It's a law of freedom, the freedom to express your innermost convictions in an embodied and flawed way, and to feel the grace of doing that and the acceptance of the fact that we're going to get it wrong. So a couple of things, I suppose, that I wanted to draw out there, like the whole thing about partiality and yet nevertheless standing with the poor. And that relationship between faith and works, and how we deal with that without falling into guilt and moralism and all of that kind of thing.